So, guys, what's your favorite day of the week?
There's only one fabulous day of the week, and that's a Friday.
Listen, I don't care if Monday's blue, Tuesday's gray, or Wednesday too, all right? Thursday, I don't care about you. Friday, baby. All right.
Ross, you haven't signed in on
I love them all. I love all that God made them all. I love them all. I love them all. What?
Look, there is only one right answer, and it's Friday. Not only because I get to kick the work week behind me, but also because that is now the day Matter of Opinion comes out.
Woo! Friday, rolling into the weekend.
Oh, well, then if you told me that.
From New York Times Opinion, I'm Lydia Polgreen.
I'm Michelle Cottle.
I'm Ross Douthat.
I'm Carlos Lozada.
And this is Matter of Opinion. Today I wanted to start by asking you guys a genealogy question. My grandfather was obsessed with genealogy, so I have a lot of information on this topic, and hopefully you do too. When did your people come to this country?
Ooh, so far back on both sides, I just don't know, actually. Way back.
Interesting. Ross?
The Douthats came to Virginia, and that would have been sometime in the early 18th century. My mother's side of the family, in fact, came at the beginning.
Like out of Garden of Eden?
Like on the Mayflower?
Like in the Plymouth Zone. They were.
Who knew you were so fancy?
Huh. Wow.
Well, fancy is a strong word, but the Snows have been in New England, as their name suggests, since Nicholas Snow on, I think, the third ship after the Mayflower, and I believe he married Constance Hopkins, who was on the Mayflower itself. If I'm getting that genealogy wrong, may all my New England ancestors strike me down.
Wow. Carlos?
Well, I don't have to go back nearly as far because it was me. I came here in 1975. A little boy of 3. My dad had applied for green cards for all of us for years. And as soon as we got them, we left Lima and moved to California. So I was a green card holder for like 4 decades, and then I became a U.S. citizen. Joined the party.
Well, we are very lucky to have you. I know you're not much of a joiner, so that's really meaningful that we got you, Carlos.
My wife's American. I have like 3 American kids. I have a house in the suburbs. I figured, okay, like I'm just gonna give up and do it.
You might
I'm gonna give up and do it. Yeah, no, and it's been great. I'd been here so long, I didn't think the naturalization ceremony would feel very emotional. It was intensely emotional. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
It is a beautiful thing. And I actually sort of bridged the divide of all of us because on one side of my family, my mother came to the United States in 1973 when she married my father. And on the other side, I have a sort of jumble of Cornish ancestors and some who go back to the Revolutionary era. So it's a real American soup. And I think that that actually is a great way to get into this conversation because we're actually going to talk about immigration today. And we think of America as being this country of immigrants, the melting pot. We all come here and take on new identities. Of course, there were people here when the original people got here. But that is the American story that we all were taught in school and love. But maybe that idea is over. And the reason I wanted to talk about this was that I saw that the mayor of my city, New York, last week made some remarks where he basically said that the flood of migrants who are coming into New York City will, quote unquote, destroy New York City, which was really surprising and kind of shocking to me. This is the city, of course, that is famous for the Statue of Liberty, which has welcomed thousands and thousands and thousands and people into our shores. But yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think? Is this over? Are we no longer the melting pot?
No, we're the melting pot. Although it's more like, I don't know, at this point, it's more like a goulash. Nothing melts so much as it just jumbles together or whatever. But the New York mayor is, for one, super dramatic, but also he's talking about a very specific issue that not just New York has been dealing with, but also D.C. and a lot of other big cities, which is that there are tens of thousands of migrants, mostly asylum seekers waiting for their claims to be processed, that have been either coming over the border on their own and getting here or being shipped by Southern governors like Greg Abbott out of Texas. And what you wind up with is a logistical problem that they're not equipped to deal with, that the city's shelter system's not equipped to deal with it. the organizations that help the migrants find their way to getting aid and housing and whatever, it's just overwhelmed. And anytime you have something that overwhelms the regular order of a city or a community, people start freaking out and using apocalyptic language. This is not the first time that America has had its issues or even issued some, kind of retrograde laws because it got overwhelmed. It will not be the last time.
Yeah, I mean, when you say it's not the first time America's had its issues, I mean, the Statue of Liberty that Lydia mentioned, it was dedicated in the same decade that the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. The same time that immigrants from Italy were encountering lots of hostility here. The mother of exiles, as she is known, can't do it alone. That lamp needs to be relit from time to time.
Yeah, I mean, it would be weird to declare the American experiment with immigration over at a time when the foreign-born share of the U.S. population is basically, not quite, but basically as high as it was during the last great peak of immigration in the late 19th century, and when all of these controversies, Mayor Adams' outbursts included, are being driven by extremely high levels of immigration across the southern border. So, I mean, we're, in effect, we're doing one of the more extreme versions of the melting pot experiment right now. And so there's, in fact, a clear correlation between that kind of increase and the kind of logistical and political reactions that you see in everything from the political success of Donald Trump in 2016 to the blue state, blue city freak out at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not actually clear that this is exactly what's causing the huge numbers of migrants that are coming to quote unquote northern cities. But, you had the governor of Texas putting people on buses to be delivered to certain hotspots. And of course, Ron DeSantis, his stunt of flying a bunch of, I believe, Venezuelan asylum seekers and migrants to Martha's Vineyard and locations like that. So this is clearly a substantive issue and one that goes to the heart of the questions about America. But it's also a huge political football at this moment. Ross, as you mentioned, without this fight over immigration, it's hard to imagine the presidency of Donald Trump as having taken place.
Right. The DeSantis flight to a vacation spot was basically a pure political stunt. The Abbott strategy is a little bit different. It's policy and politics mixed together in a way that's been, I think, quite effective at making the point that, border state governors and border state politicians have been making for a long time, that we don't have a clear strategy for maintaining order on the southern border. It's creating tons and tons of logistical stress on Texas and Arizona and New Mexico and states around there. And people who support immigration and people who support the rights of migrants and so on need to be aware that the logistical problems, independent of sort of larger questions about immigration policy, just the logistical problems of the current situation are extreme.
Well, those logistical problems also really fuel the political problems. People get really twitchy when they feel that chaos is afoot. And fair or not, the pictures from the border and the overwhelming of systems gives people a sense that things are breaking down. And that makes people more susceptible to anti-immigration rhetoric.
But I think that this is a manufactured crisis. I mean, I think the number in New York is 110,000 since last spring, which actually does not seem like that many people to me. I mean, this is a really, really big city of like 8 million people. I mean, I see the pictures of people sleeping in the streets and things like that, but these seem like problems that could potentially be solved.
Well, the issue, it seems like there's sort of it's a complex issue because so one reason that blue cities are more likely to feel overwhelmed by a large influx potentially is that they provide social services, or they are supposed to provide social services more comprehensively than conservative and red areas. So there's you're supposed to be providing shelter and resources to people in blue cities. But then if you have a generous welfare system, it becomes strained faster the more people are trying to take advantage of it. And then that's joined to the fact that under asylum rules, I believe, migrants have to wait before they apply for work permits. And the purpose of that is to prevent people from just gaming the asylum system in order to come here as economic migrants. But the result is that people are more dependent on social services, more dependent on shelters and so on because they can't work. So there is a liberal solution to this. The liberal response has been to basically say we need to make it easier for these migrants to get work permits, right? This is sort of the pro-immigration critique of the Biden White House, is that it's not making it easy enough for these migrants who come to New York or Chicago or wherever else to work. The problem with that is that is, in fact,
an incentive.
The reason the migrants are coming, right, is that they want to get work permits. So if you make it easier for them to work, you will get more migrants.
You blur the line.
I guess the one thing that I will say is that we have an unprecedented number of people across the globe on the move because of conflict, because of climate change, because of just, all of the terrible things that are happening in the world. So the escalation of it, I think, does feel distinct. And again, not that we haven't had cataclysms in this world before, but not...
Lydia, do you mean the escalation of the movement, or do you mean the escalation of the political response or backlash?
I mean the escalation of the movement. Mm-hmm. We've got 100 million people who've been displaced around the world. This is a very, very tough time. I think another part of the political agenda at work here, right, is to sort of undermine support for the welfare state. In cities like Chicago, where, they've just elected a very, very progressive mayor, feeling beleaguered by the need to sort of provide services to migrants and to live up to the social contract of these places. It actually is very similar to the situation in Europe. I mean, one of the huge tension points in Europe is that you have these incredibly generous sets of social benefits that are being offered to people who are able to enter, and making sure that those benefits are not sort of quote unquote frittered away on people who don't quote unquote belong is what's driving a lot of that right-wing populism. So I think that if there is a kind of red state strategy to create a blue state crisis, it's not just we're dealing with this problem, you need to deal with it too. I think it's also a little bit like getting rid of the tax deductions on state taxes and real estate taxes. It's a way to kind of undermine the political impulses and policy impulses of blue states and to make them seem untenable.
So, Ross, I have a question for you that's along those lines, which is that New York is currently, one of the things that Mayor Adams wants is to get rid of the right to shelter policy, which New York is unusual, and that basically if you come here, the city has to provide you shelter. Now, that system, as he points out, and which is undeniably true, was not made to cope with the massive influx of migrants that it's currently facing. On the other hand, if you get rid of it, you risk winding up with a situation like you see in San Francisco, where you have just massive tent cities, with people sleeping on the street. And the downtown of San Francisco has become somewhere that businesses are moving out of, and they're closing offices because people feel so unsafe and you can't walk a couple of blocks without problems. So what do people think is the way forward with this? I mean, on the one hand, yes, they're completely overwhelmed. On the other hand, the alternatives are not so high.
Well, the right to shelter part is its own issue, where there's sort of questions about how much money should you spend on shelters? How much shelter should you offer? That's distinct from saying there's an absolute right to shelter. I think the hope of Adams is that if you don't have the guarantee, then fewer people will be likely to come. And that then you can also build up shelter capacity at the same time, theoretically, in order to avoid the tent city scenario.
Maybe.
And Lydia is right, of course, that yes, there is sort of a Republican sense of like, yeah, we're going to heighten the contradictions of the liberal social model. But you know what? The liberal social model has a bunch of contradictions. That's the liberal social model assumes that immigrants will come to New York in an orderly fashion. But the liberal social model doesn't want to be too punitive to immigrants on the border. Okay, but that's a little bit of a tension, because it's the punitiveness on the border historically that has enabled New York to slowly absorb migrants. And if you reduce...
And let's be clear, it's not just red state governors who are doing that. But Jared Polis over in Colorado was happy to bus migrants to Chicago until the party came down on him with both feet.
Yes, it is. It is governors who are exposed to the border. I think the question for liberals here, and there are obviously a lot of open questions for conservatives, but a question for liberals here is where, if anywhere, are you willing to live with punitiveness? Like if I told you, you can have an extra X $100 billion to spend on shelters and, English as a second language and so on, and all you have to do in return for it is build the wall. Like, do you take that deal? What deal do liberals take?
The wall won't work.
Well, that's...
The wall won't work.
Won't it?
Well, then it's a good thing you have all those, zillions of dollars invested in all the social services for people who come despite the wall.
That's right. Then you really win.
This just shows how much of the debate is over symbolism as well. One thing I'm always struck about in policy debates in the United States is that they're not just about what is good or bad or what helps the most people or hurts the least people. It always comes down to a discussion of who we are. If you read the New York Times piece by former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, he addressed the situation in New York right now and basically argued that you need to allow migrants to work pretty much right away. Which, by the way, is people come because they want work. They may be attracted to cities that have more services because that is a temporary mechanism while they get on their feet. But people come here because they want to work. But anyway, that was Bloomberg's position in this piece. It's it's not just that it's smart as policy. It's because we are both a nation of immigrants and a land of opportunity.
But that's not why migrants are supposed to be granted access to the U.S., and that's the dilemma that Ross is talking about. If you turn migrants into economic immigrants...
Asylum seekers into economic migrants.
Yes,
yeah.
Asylum seekers. Then you've basically blurred the line entirely.
I think that line is blurred already. That line is blurred. That line is significantly blurred already.
So then do you just throw up your hands and say, go for it?
Well, I feel like we should probably take a break and talk about all of the options when we come back. And we're back. So, based on our conversation so far, I would venture to say that actual reform to our immigration system feels like it'll be impossible. I mean, if we can't even find our way to supporting asylum seekers who were literally obligated to help under an international law, how can we actually hope for real change? But maybe that's too pessimistic. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I mean, there's two separate issues here. There's the question of what flows of immigration should the U.S. government bless and endorse? What mixture of, skills from different immigrants should we be trying to encourage? Should we be, have a more humanitarian focused policy or a more sort of recruitment focused policy in the way that Canada has traditionally had, joined to what specific security measures should we have at the border? That's sort of the landscape of all the attempted big immigration compromises of the last 20 years. But then there's the thing that's actually driving the crisis, which is that, as Lydia says, America has a set of obligations under, our laws and international law around asylum claims. And what's happened in the last 5 or 10 years is that you have had lots and lots, and by lots, I mean hundreds of thousands and millions of people essentially coming to the U.S. and trying to use asylum claims as a means of economic migration. And we don't have a clear mechanism for addressing that strategy on the part of people who want to enter the United States.
Well, I think the direction that is happening globally is one of hardening of borders and also the externalization of the problem. We've tried to do that with Mexico. The European Union has done it with, they pay off the Libyan Coast Guard, which is, a horrific organization with a terrible human rights track record. We had the story over the summer of this, the Greek Coast Guard basically letting a ship with hundreds of people on it just drown in the Mediterranean. This just absolutely absolutely kind of like morally bankrupt. But at the same time, I think that these policies are responding to a politics of refusal. And what I see is an increasingly bipartisan consensus. And you see this in the UK where the Labour Party and the Tory Party, the differences between them on these issues feels like they're getting smaller. They're getting smaller and smaller rather than bigger and bigger. And I think all politicians who aim to hold power are struggling to contend with the fact that, like, people just don't want outsiders to come from the poor world to the rich world. That is just the cold, hard fact. I have a lot of feelings about that. I think that migration is the least expensive form of reparations for colonialism, for slavery, for all the horrible things that the West has done to the rest of the world. But, I'm clearly a minority in believing that.
I think if you try that approach as a way to convince Americans they need to welcome in migrants, they do not want to hear about that. I mean, they just don't.
No, we don't want to hear about our history anyway, right? We don't want to talk about slavery. But yeah.
Well, okay. So I disagree, Lydia, with that view of where Western public opinion stands, because the way you're describing it makes it sound like we're living in an era when Western countries have successfully built walls against mass migration and are just keeping people out. As I said earlier in our discussion, the United States currently has one of the highest foreign-born percentages of its population in its history, comparable to the late 19th century, and in part because of there was a real dip in migration under the Trump presidency, but now immigration rates are back up. So if you just look at numbers, the West does not have a policy of refusal. It is attempting to manage incredibly large potential flows driven by changes in technology that make it easier for people to migrate long distances. We used to just get economic migrants from Mexico. Now we get them from Central America, Latin America, and people from Africa and Asia coming through Latin America. And the West doesn't know how to manage these flows without punitive measures. A big part of the West recoils from punitive measures for good reasons, but this is why I reject the idea that there is just some sort of rational policy solution. I don't know what the rational policy solution is. My views are obviously to the right, probably of all of you guys on this question, but I'm not anti-immigration. I don't think anyone is going to be anti-immigration. The number of people coming to the rich world is high and likely to increase no matter what we do.
Well, that speaks, though, to your earlier point, which is that why do people get fired up about something like this? And it's because they are in the midst of facing something they find scary. If you don't have high immigration, people don't get freaked out about it. It's at times of change when they see something in their community or their country that is happening and that they feel a little bit out of control on, that they are susceptible to hideous demagoguery of the sorts that Trump traffics in. If we weren't facing a influx of migrants and foreign-born folks, you wouldn't have this issue. So those things go together.
Carlos?
I don't know. I always am a bit troubled / amused by the conflating of immigration and the border. We talk about a nation of immigrants. We talk about the melting pot. We talk about what it means for this country to be a nation of immigrants. And we obsess entirely over what's happening on the border and not the story of immigrants in America, all over America, transforming cities and towns, being transformed by them as well over the course of generations. I get frustrated when sort of immigration policy is almost entirely about what happens at the border.
Well, that's the whole thing. The majority of people who wind up illegal immigrants, and we're shifting from, kind of asylum seekers here, overstay their visas. It's not that they were flooding across a particular border, but that makes for less dramatic scenes and less political grandstanding. So that's not what people like to talk about because it's just much more complicated and lends itself less to those great political commercials you see where a candidate goes down to the border and has scary, grainy video of somebody sneaking over.
Well, it's what Democrats like to talk about. I mean, that's half of our national conversation. There's lots of people who want to talk about what Carlos is talking about. They're just mostly political liberals, and no one in the Biden administration wants to talk about the border. They want to have a conversation about the positive impacts that immigration has on American society, which I agree.
Well, then you get into the really complicated piece, which is the cultural stuff, which I think Ross was talking about when he's saying there's not a rational solution to this, because a lot of it's not rational. I mean, it's people seeing a shifting society that's becoming more diverse. A lot of people like that. A lot of people think that's great. And a lot of people don't. A lot of people are very uncomfortable with not having English spoken when they go to their local gas station or their local grocery store. And that's something that is not really fixable by policy, and it's not really kind of a rational approach. And I don't know how you get around that.
It's a thing that we've overcome in our country, in our history over,
Yeah, but it makes it more susceptible to demagoguery. And we are dealing in a time when Trump dialed it up to 11.
Well, so one, to clarify, when I say there isn't a simply rational solution, I just meant on the policy question, where it seems like you have figuring out how you can actually have control over the rate of immigration while also, being adequately humanitarian, living up to international obligations and so on. That's a really hard challenge that there may be a rational solution, but there isn't a simple rational solution. I would dispute that people who respond negatively to, their language no longer being spoken as much in their own neighborhood are being irrational. I don't know what the term irrational means in that context.
I mean people have culture that way.
I mean, they may be being racist, but people have cultural preferences. That's a normal feature of human societies. And, we sort of root for the people who have those cultural preferences when we see them as beleaguered and beset. If you went to rural Ireland and talked to people who were worried about Gaelic disappearing, liberals would be sympathetic to that. But people in the Midwest who don't like, Spanish or other languages being spoken in their neighborhood seem unsympathetic because they seem like winners who are not being kind enough to the marginalized. But either way, this is just human nature. And the way we've dealt with it historically in the U.S. successfully has been to have waves of immigration and then have periods of immigration restriction. We have increased and decreased immigration rates in ways that have reflected people's preferences for the speed or lack thereof of cultural change. And again, those restrictions were often racist, often incredibly harsh, and people don't want to bring them back. But that is the actual management strategy for that problem that has been used, right? And
I don't see this as a particular turning point, because we've done this a million times before. And you can be embarrassed that we've done it. You can be ashamed that we've done it. But it's not like this is some new horrible anti-immigrant moment that we have not seen before in the U.S. I do think these things tend to be cyclical.
Well, I think just given the sort of toxicity of all of this, is there a way to think about a more kind of orderly and humane way to deal with what is clearly a problem without a solution?
I mean, I think part of the Biden White House strategy has been to try and get people to apply for asylum outside the U.S. before they show up at the border. And I think, if I'm remembering it right, the Biden administration has been sued from the left for this policy. But that seems like it's more of a stopgap mechanism. I don't have a sort of comprehensive solution, but that has been one of as an alternative to something like a full-scale Remain in Mexico policy, that has been an option floated to try and sort of manage the line and I assume sort of weed out bad claims before the claimants are actually in the United States.
And I do think it's going to be multi-pronged. I mean, there is a lot of investment that could be made in the asylum courts or expanding who can process claims, because right now, with 1 million claims backlog, these people who come over know that they're going to sit around for years, literally years, before they get their case heard. That's just, you have to have more investment in getting the system able to handle the numbers.
So no one wants to make the case for a grand bargain, Carlos? Do you see a grand bargain?
No, the only grand bargain I would want to see is one in which we recognize that it's not merely a matter of like what particular mix of policies attracts what kind of immigrants to the United States or to anywhere. People move when they have to move. People up stakes and leave when they have to leave. Venezuelan immigrants are all over South America. It's not just that people are drawn to New York or to some other place because of the, social welfare policies or something. People are leaving Venezuela because it's an economic and political catastrophe, what that country has endured. And people are also coming because of, pent-up demand for migration after since the COVID restrictions, went away. It is a complex mix of reasons that is creating these flows of people around the world. And I think that any debate over the technicalities of policy need to recognize first and foremost that this is a human crisis. I don't mean humanitarianism policy. I mean, it's a human crisis. It's a crisis of individual families, individual people, individual countries.
And has been going on throughout the history of the world, right?
Forever.
I mean, people have always moved. They've moved because the climate has changed. The movement of people is inevitable and it's going to happen. I don't know that we've come up with an orderly way to solve the problem here in America, or that we ever will. So maybe we should just leave it there.
I mean, I think we've done a good job, to pat ourselves on the back, of emphasizing the genuine intractability of some of these problems, which
We
is
have
the
laid
point.
bare
Which is
how
well.
which is important. There's always a sense that, like, well, if you could just get the reasonable people on both sides in the room to hammer out a deal, we would have a deal. And I think migration in the 21st century is going to be a situation where all policy responses are provisional.
Amen. Amen.
On
to
that.
Very
that
upbeat
cheerful
note.
All right, let's leave it there. And when we come back, hot and cold. Okay, guys, it's time for hot cold. So who's got the hot cold this week?
I gotcha. I am chilly. Not frosty, but chilly on the obsessive customer satisfaction survey culture that we are living in.
Oof.
So in part, this is just tiresome and annoying. I do not want to have to fill out a freaking survey every time I talk to my car insurance guy or buy a chair or check into a hotel, but I am frequently asked to do this multiple times per encounter. And frankly, the whole thing feels a little bit like nonsense. I mean, the airlines offer lots of customer satisfaction surveys, and yet air travel remains a little piece of hell. So what is the point? And then if we want to get more philosophical, this whole obsession just invites customers, consumers, patients to whine endlessly about every nitpicky little thing, which people already do too much of. And in some cases, they want you to focus on tangential things like whether you felt properly respected by the front office staff at the dentist or by the gate agent at Delta. And like, these do not make professionals better at what they do so much as they just teach us all that griping constantly, as I gripe constantly here, is how you're supposed to go through life. I get what the companies are going for, but I'm saying on balance, this has gone too far and is not a force for good. It's just not.
So are you compelled to complete these surveys in exchange for the services that you receive? No.
You're not compelled, but you get multiple requests. It's on your text, it's on your email, it's at the end of your phone calls. I'm not saying that I'm being forced to do this. I'm just saying, really, is this necessary?
I feel like the pressure...
Is it helpful?
But doesn't the pressure run, to me, the pressure runs the other way. It's not that I feel like I'm being encouraged to whine. It's more like the person who has just helped me is now acting as though, their job depends on me.
Oh, no, that is true as well.
saying nice
Absolutely.
things.
I feel super guilty.
I think a version of this is good. I just think simplicity is best. Like, I appreciate that Uber, you can give your driver a set of stars. It's one click. If the driver has been terrible, you can give them 2 stars. I almost always give 5 stars, but there is an option for complaint. To me, it's when you get a survey and it's like, here's page 1.
It goes on.
Right. And you're just not going to do it. But then I feel guilty that I have let down the nice associate. The clerk at Macy's deserved. They deserved my going through all those pages.
Well, I think my primary resentment and the place where I will join you in frustration about this is that it feels to me like a bizarre way to sort of force your customers to do work. The basic job of training your employees to do their job decently, and I will add, these employees should be paid well and or at least decently and have good working conditions, and that will. Those are the things that I think will go the furthest to improving customer service. I mean, the poor beleaguered person who's dealing with, irate passengers at the check-in desk at Delta at JFK, like, they're just part of the machine, and I feel sorry for them. So yeah.
Here's what I would suggest.
Please tell me.
I think that if you actually want to help your harried, beleaguered employee, it's not necessarily by filling out the customer service survey, but it may be by getting the person's name who helped you and who you're so impressed by, and then going out of your way, taking a little time out of our lives to signal to whoever their supervisor might be that they did great today. And
Carlos, are you making even more work for me?
So now, I see we actually don't want to help them. We just want to get rid of these these cumbersome.
By saying that I find them tiresome and annoying.
Will no one rid me of this troublesome clerk?
This troublesome clerk.
So, we can, I'm going to send a note to the opinion editor and just say how awesome the 3 of you were today.
Bring it. Bring it.
I am always hot on praise. So, guys, thank you so much for another great discussion.
Thanks. See you next week.
Thanks for joining our conversation. If you liked it, follow Matter of Opinion on your favorite podcast app. And if you want to tell us the story of how your family came to America, email us at matterofopinion@nytimes.com. Matter of Opinion is produced by Phoebe Lett, Sophia Alvarez-Boyd, and Derek Arthur. It is edited by Stephanie Joyce. Our fact-check team is Kate Sinclair, Mary Marge Locker, and Michelle Harris. This episode was mixed by Efim Shapiro. Original music by Isaac Jones, Efim Shapiro, Carol Saburo, Sonia Herrero, and Pat McCusker. Audience strategy by Shannon Busta and Christina Samuelewski. Our executive producer is Annie Rose Strasser.